Hey class, welcome back. Today we are still talking about civil rights, and today we're talking about African American civil rights. There's lots of different protests, lots of different leaders, lots of different things that happened during the African American civil rights movement, and that's some of the things we're going to cover today. With that being said, we will get started. The African American civil rights movement was an ongoing fight for racial equality, and it took place for over 100 years after the Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1865. Well, it was around 1964 before before they got the civil rights movement and everything took place. So they had leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Booker T. Washington, Rosa Parks, all these men and women here. They all paved the way for the nonviolent protests, which led to changes in these laws.
What was it? The African American civil rights movement was an ongoing fight for racial equality that took place for over 100 years after the Civil War. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Booker T. Washington, and Rosa Parks paved the way for nonviolent protests, which led to changes in the law.
All right. So when most people talk about civil rights, and I've said this earlier in our unit movement, they're talking about the protests that happened in the 1950s and 1960s that led to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So the Civil Rights Act that took place was almost 100 years later. It was 100 years almost after the Civil War had ended. But when you talk about the Civil Rights Movement, most people are talking about the 1950s and 60s protests and stuff that led up to that.
Civil rights movement. When people talk about the civil rights movement, they're talking about the protests in the 1950s and 1960s that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1960.
All right. So the abolitionist movement, civil rights movement, it has its background in the abolitionist movement before the Civil War took place. Abolitionists were people that thought slavery was wrong, and they wanted it to come to an end. You had several different abolitionists that led the charge here, other than before the Civil War. So many of the northern states had outlawed slavery during this time, and we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, or attempted to free the slaves. It didn't really officially happen until after the Civil War was over, but it freed about 50,000 of 4 million slaves at the time. So after the war, slavery was made illegal with the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Abolitionist movement. The civil rights movement has its background in the abolitionist movement before the Civil War. Abolitionists were people that thought slavery was morally wrong and wanted it to come to an end. Before the Civil War, many of the northern states had outlawed slavery. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. After the war, slavery was made illegal with the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
All right. So after the Civil War, many southern states continued to treat African Americans as second-class citizens. All right. They implemented laws that kept black people separate from white people, and these laws were called Jim Crow laws. They required separate schools, separate restrooms, separate bathrooms or restrooms, separate transportation based on the person or color of a person's skin, and other laws prevented many black people from voting. So all of this happened in the southern states after the Civil War that were called Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow laws. After the Civil War, many southern states continued to treat African Americans as second-class citizens. They implemented laws that kept black people separate from white people. These laws became known as Jim Crow laws. They required separate schools, restaurants, restrooms, and transportation based on the color of a person's skin. Other laws prevented many black people from voting.
All right. So in the early 1900s, black people began to protest these Jim Crow laws. This was 35 years or so after the Civil War had ended. So several African American leaders, such as Webb Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, they joined together and they formed the NAACP. And another leader, Booker T. Washington, he helped to form schools to educate African Americans in order to improve their status in society. So they formed the NAACP with Webb Du Bois and Ida B. Wells.
Jim Crow laws continued. In the early 1900s, Black people began to protest Jim Crow laws that Southern states were implementing to enforce segregation. Several African American leaders, such as Webb Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, joined together to found the NAACP in 1909. Another leader, Booker T. Washington, helped to form schools to educate African Americans in order to improve their status in society.
All right, so the movement kept growing. The civil rights movement, it gained momentum in the 1950s when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools was illegal in the case versus Brown versus the Board of Education. So what happened after this, they brought in Little Rock, Arkansas, you had the Little Rock Nine, they brought in federal troops to ensure that they could go into the school with the Little Rock Nine and attend a previously all-white high school. Brown versus the Board of Education was a big case in the civil rights movement for African Americans.
The movement grows. The civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools was illegal in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Federal troops were brought into Little Rock, Arkansas to allow the Little Rock Nine to attend a previously all-white high school.
All right, so major events in the movement. The 1950s and early 1960s brought about several big events or major events. You had Rosa Parks here. Rosa Parks in 1955. She was arrested because she got on the bus, she sat on the seat, and she refused to move to let a white passenger have her seat. And this caused the Montgomery bus boycott, which Martin Luther King Jr. got in front or to the forefront of the movement. King led a number of nonviolent protests, including the Birmingham campaign and the March on Washington. He was a big part of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was.
Major events in the movement in the 1950s and early 1960s brought about several major events in the fight for the civil rights of African Americans. In 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. This sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for over a year and brought Martin Luther King Jr. to the forefront of the movement. King led a number of nonviolent protests, including the Birmingham campaign and the March on Washington.
All right, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this is what all this was building up to. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. All right, this act, it outlawed segregation, it did away with the Jim Crow laws of the South, and it outlawed discrimination based on race, national background, and gender. There were still many issues, but the law gave the NAACP and other organizations a strong base to fight discrimination in the courts. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was what desegregated schools and outlawed these Jim Crow laws.
Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. This act outlawed segregation and the Jim Crow laws of the South. It also outlawed discrimination based on race, national background, and gender. Although there were still many issues, this law gave the NAACP and other organizations a strong base on which to fight discrimination in the courts.
All right, what constitutional amendment made slavery illegal? Was it A, the 13th Amendment, B, the 11th Amendment, or C, the 3rd Amendment? It was the 13th Amendment.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 2, what were people called who worked to outlaw slavery? This was before the Civil War. A, prohibitionists, B, abolitionists, or C, slavers. It was B, abolitionists. You had several different people that worked as abolitionists during that time.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 3, what were the laws called that separated black people from white people? Was it A, Jim Crow laws, B, New Deal laws, or C, Lincoln laws? It was called the Jim Crow laws. They were outlawed along with segregation in school with the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, what civil rights leader refused to give up their seat on the bus to a white person? Was it A, Martin Luther King Jr., B, Rosa Parks, or C, Harriet Tubman? It was B, Rosa Parks. She would not get up and move her
ding, ding, ding.
Move from the seat, and it sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. Number 5, what president signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law? A, Dwight D. Eisenhower, B, Jimmy Carter, or C, Lyndon Johnson? It was Lyndon Johnson. He was the president of the United States at the time.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And that is it for today. I will see you back next time. We'll be talking about Native American civil rights. You all have a very good day.